Hello and a warm welcome back. I decided today that I would make this video. Why? There was a reason for it. A few days ago, about a week ago, I published chapter, I think 15, from my book Moses, Path of Truth as a free audiobook, which reveals who Moses really was. And this morning I got to watch a video by Hans J. Lakowski, from Tar Astro. I have to admit openly, I really admire him, for his outstanding and enlightening work. He picked up on the topic of my video and not only laid out the cards to see if it's really true that Moses, Ramos, was an Egyptian pharaoh, but he also gave a personal statement based on his own experiences, which has to do with the Kabbalah and the teachings of this one particular group of people from the Middle East. And that really moved me. It really touched me. I didn't know that he was so deeply involved and knew so much about it, and that he could connect the dots so well. I thought the video, please watch it in its entirety. I'm going to use a few small excerpts, 3 or 4 minutes, in my video today. But please do take the time to watch his whole video as well, because he explains so many connections in such a short time that, in my opinion, his half-hour video just flies by. Check it out. So, yeah, what's that picture I have in the background, my friends? Look, Hans Lakowski also says that I'm not the first one to promote this. That there are, others as well, like Bruce Wallace, I think he mentions. Very, very interesting. I've never read his works, and he says there are a lot of synchronicities there, which makes it all the more impressive for me, of course, if this research largely matches up. On the other hand, I go so far as to say that we shouldn't just talk about what didn't happen from a biblical context, but that we can also talk about the other side, what really did happen. And if we look at the picture behind us, we see an image from the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And this picture shows someone, a person named Zipporah. And that was the wife of Moses. I mean, just look at this lady with her white skin, rosy cheeks, and light blonde hair. She looks like a Swedish beauty, right? A Nordic beauty. Yeah, and even the eye color. You have to ask yourself, what is a picture like this, Moses' wife Zipporah, doing in the Sistine Chapel? And we know that they always have to tell us the truth in some form. Look, when a Catholic Church commissions a painting for the Sistine Chapel, no matter which artist does it, they dictate how the painting should look. Nothing is left to chance. This is not artistic freedom being displayed here. The Church, when it comes to religious paintings created by artists, specifies everything exactly: eye color, skin color, the people around, what the surroundings should look like, and so on. Nothing is left to chance, because in everything, even in colors, we see red and green, right? Even the colors of Christmas, the colors of our Nordic ancestors' Christmas tree that we still have today, gold, green, and red. They also have a meaning. And, again, nothing is left to chance. There's a reason why it looks the way it does. And she's supposed to have come from the land of Media. MHM. That could be really hard to justify, right? I have a completely different theory about that, but that will come out in just a moment from our joint investigation. I've decided to really lay it all out on the table today. I've decided to reveal a bit more, to discuss it with you all. I've decided that I'm going to share some truths with you that are deeply hidden in the book. I can only touch on them here in this video, so if you really want to go deeper, please get the audiobook. Get a YouTube membership, then the audiobook is even free. Or just buy the book for everyone who likes to have something to hold and read. I'm that kind of person too. I prefer to have something in my hands. Yeah, I can take notes in it. I can put it down and pick it up again, fold the corners, and do whatever I want with it. Look, let's take a quick look at what significance Moses actually has for our time. For, well, the friends of synagogues and the rabbis. If we unravel this story, just like we've already unraveled so many stories, then a completely new field of consciousness forms around us and a new context emerges. If we know that these biblical Old Testament elements or contents were, for the most part, falsified and represent untruths, then we really have to question everything that's currently happening in those regions, even geopolitically. It would turn our worldview upside down. Let's be aware of that. And if we put that out into the field, even into the morphogenetic field, we bring healing into it. Because even a figure like Moses deserves rehabilitation, since he was not the Dark One, he was not the genocidal mass murderer as is claimed. He never followed Yahweh. And that's the truth, my dear friends. It simply is what it is. So, let's briefly dive into these topics. So, what you know about the stories of Moses, I'm going to play you a little trailer about that. Okay, watch this. It's 10 seconds long and then we'll talk about it afterwards. All right, pay attention. I'm going to play it now.
Okay, so I told you all to trust the process. But knew y'all wanted to stay in Egypt, stacking bricks.
Okay, that was a funny little trailer. What if Moses had a phone with a selfie function? But it's about the parting of the sea. That's where it all starts. Just like in my book, I also begin with Moses and the topic of the parting of the Red Sea. In the Bible, it's described as a sea of reeds. Yeah, the Red Sea is not a sea of reeds. Okay? So, but there is one thing. Supposedly, this one people were enslaved to build pyramids or temples, among other things in Pyramus. There isn't a single extra-biblical piece of evidence for that. Just by the way. But to the north-northeast of there, on the Mediterranean, there's a bay, a lake, called the Serbonian Lake. I described this very precisely in the book, with pictures as well. It has a kind of U-shape that you can walk across, which lets you bypass the mainland and, under certain circumstances, avoid hostile territories. So, back then, they crossed this Serbonian Lake with a few people. Nowadays there are breaks in the Serbonian Lake where you can't get through, there's water there. So people assumed, well, then it wouldn't have been possible back then either. But no, the truth is, we've reached a point in human history where we can, may, and should learn the truth. What we're allowed to share now, even in this video today, wouldn't have been possible just a few decades ago. Why is that? Apart from, of course, the information itself. Moses actually told us his story himself. He guided us and showed us how to find the evidence, otherwise, we never would have found it. It's just too hard to pick out that one small part where the truth lies from thousands of writings. But we were guided. Look, the Serbonian Sea, scientific and geological studies have been conducted, and during the time of Ramses III, that's when it happened, and shortly after, during Ramses VIII, it was actually deeper than the Mediterranean is today. That means, at that time, it was determined that this bridge, the Serbonian Sea, was connected. Aha, you could cross it. Okay, is that just a coincidence? Then it would be one. But we'll get to many more facts where we'll have to say, it can't just be a coincidence anymore, especially when we start connecting the dots, you know, when there are several of them. So, and it's also interesting that Baal-Zephon is located there, which is mentioned in the Bible. So we have yet another piece of evidence that this was probably the route. So, splitting the sea wasn't that easy. Now, here's something else. The Bible says there were 500,000 men. 500,000 men. What does that mean? Children, plus women, children, and cattle, the whole caravan. Yeah, let's say we're talking about 2 million people. Goodness, that would have been more, almost more than half the population of northern Egypt at that time. Okay, and you see, it really starts to sound unbelievable. It becomes extremely unbelievable. And now let's just do the math. Let's calculate. Even if we lined up 10 people side by side, just 10, with 2 million people, we have 200,000 rows one after another, walking. Okay? 200,000 rows, let's say with 2 meters between each, and that's a conservative estimate, we'd have a caravan of, 200,000, 400,000 meters. The caravan would be 400 kilometers long with that many people. That's just not possible. Okay? Then supposedly the pharaoh chased after them and drowned in the sea. They still haven't found him to this day. And all the pharaohs who were considered possible candidates by the religions, they eventually found them in some tombs. Yeah, well, then it couldn't have been him if you found him. So, which one was it then? The one who drowned in the sea? Yeah, then it was him. And then a year later, they discovered his mummy, and then it was like, yeah, so it can't be him after all. So there is no evidence for this outside of the Bible. Period. All right. Even if 20 people had been standing side by side, it still would have been 200 kilometers, and even if it had been 20 kilometers, that's already almost unthinkable. Okay? All right. So, something doesn't add up in this story. Still, there's usually a kernel of truth hidden in it. Moses existed, but the Exodus never happened the way it's claimed, not with the number of people that's claimed, and not with the people who are claimed to have been involved. Archaeology and biblical studies, of course, can't get to the heart of things and to the truth because they would have to deviate from biblical dogma. And as long as you don't do that, you can't find the truth. It's simple. That's it. So, we went to the trouble. We didn't find a single pharaoh under whom the enslavement of this particular people took place. Okay, so it's just a story to support a supposed suffering. All right, let's move on. That's just how the facts are. Then we look for a pharaoh under whom there were inconsistencies, disputes, struggles for the throne, problems. So, Ramses II was probably the longest reigning king in the history of Egypt and almost in all of human history. His reign was endlessly peaceful. Then his son Ramses III came to power. And Ramses III was eventually murdered in what was called the Pentor conspiracy. That's the name of it, and I explain it in detail in the book as part of this harem conspiracy, with his throat cut. They found the mummy, so we know it's true. Of course, he had sons and children. And then a struggle for power began in Egypt. And unfortunately, some of his children were involved in this conspiracy and in the murder. We know that Moses was supposedly driven out of his country because, I think the story goes, he killed an Egyptian overseer for whipping or tormenting a slave. And that's why he was pursued by the pharaoh. None of that actually happened, but Moses really did have to leave the country. That's actually true. So the core of the story is correct. But why? Because he was on the side of light. Because he knew who was involved in the murder of his father, Ramses III, because he almost had to watch it happen, and the two of them were soulmates. It hurt him deeply, and some of his own brothers had conspired against their father, and therefore against him as well. They would have hunted him down, because he knew everything. So he had to flee. And that's the point where he went abroad for several years and worked there. So, then he eventually came back. And if we assume that Ramses III was his father, then we can look at the order of successors, and the sequence of successors clearly shows us in history that each of them was only on the throne for a few years, sometimes just a single year, and then they were assassinated and murdered. There was an incredible struggle for the throne. That's why, in the end, it was also the downfall of the Ramessides. That was the downfall of the dynasty of the Ramses kings, because that's where things went off the rails. Before that, everything was fine. So, at some point, those who knew that Moses, Ramses VIII, was aware were no longer around. They were also gone, dead, eliminated, and so on. And eventually, he was able to return unbothered. And that's exactly what he did, but he was only on the throne for a year. That's Ramses VIII. And during that time, he united several peoples. Yes, but which peoples did he unite? That's the big question. Look. During the reign of Ramses III, there was a massive attack, and this is well documented in various papyri. I believe the Harris Papyrus, another papyrus, and countless reliefs in Medinet Habu. Anyway, an interesting name. Habu, the harbor builder, who also, has a Nordic connection, according to the Old Testament. And what was the name of the people who invaded Egypt? During the reign of Ramses III, the Philistines. So who were the Philistines? In the Bible, they were the fiercest enemies of the Hebrews. And their conflict ended in the famous battle between David and Goliath. That never actually happened like that. We've also debunked that, and in my next books I'll reveal who David and Goliath really were. But that's another story. Researchers are now fairly certain about who the Philistines originally were. No, they were not Asian steppe peoples. So who were they? The adversaries of the Israelites in the Old Testament. The Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena conducted genetic studies on Philistine bone remains, of which there are plenty, including some in Egypt from the battle. Even the renowned magazine Science Advance reported on this. And the researchers agreed that the Philistines came from Northern Europe. Well, period. Well, that's something else. And then we look at the Egyptians' own records, where they talk about the Philistine attack. So what do they actually say in the Harris Papyrus about who they were? It literally says, and I quote from this papyrus, they came from the islands and mainlands at the World Sea in the far north. We've been lied to about the Philistines for thousands of years. And the Philistines are the key to Israel. We'll get to that. They are from the islands in the ocean, the North Sea, from the ends of the earth. The Egyptians called the ends of the earth the so-called ninth bow. So, they had a world map with 9 bows. And the ninth bow is located exactly where today, I think, the 54th or 53rd parallel is. That's where Heligoland is, roughly at that latitude. That's where they came from. Then the Egyptians wrote that the main cities were destroyed and the islands were torn up and blown away by the storm. Yes, we know about this the great impact of a meteoroid or comet. People usually say meteoroid. I think, it was a rock that hit in front of the Heligoland Bight, around 1227-26 BC. That was the trigger for this flight or migration of peoples to the south, among other places to Egypt. So, that's what the Egyptians wrote about the Philistines. Now we know who the Philistines were. That's incredible. And they migrated into the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Empire, which experienced a great natural disaster, and they refounded the Greek Empire. Right? And during the time of Ramses III, the water level, the sea level, in many parts of Europe, including the Mediterranean, dropped by several meters. Yes, in some places, marshes and rivers were drained. Many Bronze Age settlements were abandoned, and people set out on their way. And this drop in sea level later allowed Moses to cross the Sea of Zeboim. Okay? That's the parting of the sea. It's a very simple explanation. Okay, the core of it is true. It's correct, but not the way it's described. Right? And that's how he was able to cross the Sea of Zeboim in the north-northeast of Pyramus, where Baal-Zephon is also located. It's incredible. There were also many volcanic eruptions back then. Today we know this from scientific studies and the earthquakes that occurred in the Mediterranean region. The eruption of Santorini also happened at that time, and it must have been devastating, because the fissure actually opened up 300 meters below the waterline and created a tsunami wave within the Mediterranean that, according to scientists, was about 30 meters high and destroyed the entire Cretan fleet. The flood of peoples from northern and central Europe, Mycenae could hardly defend itself against that. Egypt managed to defend itself against the Philistines. And yeah, that's just how it was at that time. And of course, the Philistines took advantage of the destruction of this Minoan naval power to occupy Crete, plunder palaces, and so on and so forth. We can actually still measure archaeological finds today, like in Württemberg, in Germany, and on the North Sea. The consequences of that catastrophe back then can truly be identified archaeologically. Already back then, wrote about it. Very, very well, my dears. But as I said, the Egyptian sources report about the Philistines, who came from the remaining and sunken islands that were located in the Northern Ocean. And they were referred to as Hanabu. From the land of Amber. It makes us wonder, why is this site called Medinet Habu, and why do they call the northern peoples Hanabu? We'll clear that up at some point too. Right? The Danish word hem means harbor, and you can trace that back more than 3,000 years. And once again, the Egyptians divided the world from north to south into 10 circles or arcs, and on the 9th arc they said, that's where the Philistines came from, and that just happens to be the 54th parallel. And that's why the Egyptians also called the Philistines the Nine-Bow people. That's where it comes from. These are the regions of Europe bordering the North and Baltic Seas. And that's where the islands were, which were torn from the sea and sank. Then, for example, when we look at these attacking Philistines, we can clearly see in the drawings, the reliefs in the papyri and the reliefs, that they have round shields. At that time, such shields did not exist in the Mediterranean region or in Asia. The round shields were typically Nordic, as were the horsehair plumes, which the Romans later adopted as well. The originals came from Norwegian fjord horses. That's where they came from. The same goes for the short sword. Mineral analyses have also been done on short swords found in Medinet Habu. They were manufactured on Heligoland. Are there any more proofs, I ask? That's all pretty obvious now, isn't it? We really do need to seriously readjust a lot of things in our minds when it comes to history. Yeah, and, well, I think a lot of us are probably wondering where we actually come from. Who our own people were, what they experienced over the course of thousands of years. Nothing to do with barbarians and all that. We didn't live in caves, and where we put down our roots and made an impact, well, that's really, really fascinating. And there are more than 10,000 square meters of reliefs in Medinet Habu about this battle and about the Philistines and the Egyptians. The Egyptian, the German Egyptologist, Bela Bell, I think that's his name. He also said that this is the most interesting story he has ever seen. These are the most fascinating historical documents that have come down to us. That's what he called them. He calls them texts of the highest historical value, but they get no attention in the world of history because they would turn everything upside down. Yes, and the Harris Papyrus, it was 39 meters long. Yes, then we have the Apura Papyrus, which was found in Memphis and confirms all of this. And of course, we have the Philistines all over the Old Testament, where they appear as the greatest enemies of the Israelites. Yeah, well. And the Philistines were, you could say, a people that were part of a large coalition of various tribes and nations, Celtic, Germanic tribes, who then went to Egypt around 1200 BC. And where did they go from Egypt after they lost? And that's documented. Mauritania. They mixed in with the Berber peoples. This has been proven today. And they also went east. And guess where? From Egypt. The Philistines are called Philistin in English, and they are the founders of the land of Palestine. And all the major names of the Pentapolis there, the 5 great cities, Gaza, Ekron, and the others, are Indo-European terms, ancient Proto-Nordic terms. That means the Nordic sea peoples who failed in Egypt, and here's the thing, settled there, even in Egypt, and were tolerated because the Ramessides recognized that they were related and held talks with them. They were allowed to stay there, mingled with the local peoples, and then migrated west and east. And with whom did they migrate east? 25 years later, after the incident with Moses. Very fascinating. That means we actually have a historical tradition that gives us a pharaoh under whom it could have happened, that gives us the location, that gives us the political power structure, and that confirms the story of Moses' exile and return. All of this happened in that one era, or rather, within those 20, 25, 30 years. And we find the answers to everything described in the Bible, just with a different core of truth. It happened differently than we are told. And then Moses united the peoples there, the Philistine tribes, and led them to Palestine. It's that simple. And we actually have proof that Palestine was founded by the Philistines. That's where it gets its name from. There's an inscription in Medinet Habu that literally says, the peoples from the ocean in the far north made a conspiracy on their islands. That's true. They planned to lay their hands on all the lands up to the ends of the earth. No land could withstand their weapons. Yes, they conquered Greece, Turkey, and the land of Galatia. Yes, the letters to the Galatians, which we know from the Bible. Those were actually French Gauls who lived there. That has also now been scientifically and archaeologically proven. They founded the city of Ancyra, an Indo-Germanic Nordic term, which is now Ankara, and so on and so forth. From Hutti to Code, Carchemish, Yared, and Heres were destroyed at the same time. They set up their camps at a place in Amuru. They came with a fire prepared before them and said, the fire was what had happened, onward to Egypt. That was their slogan. Allied with them were the Peliset, who are the Philistines, also called Palasadi, the Sakar, the Danes, the Sekels, and the Vasasa. In their hearts, they were full of confidence and assurance and said, our plans will succeed. End of quote. So, the Hutti were the Hittites, with whom they were associated. Code was the southeastern part of Asia Minor and northern Syria. Carchemish, was located on the Euphrates. Jared is Crete. Jerry's is Cyprus today. That was actually its name back then. Amuru is the land of the Amorites, that is, Palestine. And, as I said, not all of the tribes' names can be identified today, but some can. What is known is that the Peliset, as mentioned, were the Philistines, who are also known from the Old Testament. The Vasasa could, of course, have been inhabitants of Corsica, since they are also referred to as the Vasasas of the sea, and the capital of Corsica used to be called Baesa, but also Vasasa. So, probably Corsica. Yes, and then they settled on the west coast of Palestine, the land of the Philistines. Very, very, very fascinating. And now, of course, the question arises, who actually has a claim to this land of Palestine? If we add up these historical facts, which are not fairy tales from 1001 Nights, then the German government could now say, yes. Well, if Israel is cleaning up in Palestine right now, then let's just occupy it ourselves and turn it into a German Mediterranean Riviera. Come on, people. Then we wouldn't be doing anything different than those who are doing it right now. We wouldn't be any better, would we? Because what's happening there right now is barbaric. You really have to ask yourself who the real barbarians are at the moment. And there's one more thing I want to tell you. So, who all has settled in Palestine? I mean, let's not even talk about the people who were there before everyone else. And after the Philistines? The Romans occupied it, the Egyptians occupied it, Alexander the Great took it over, the Persians conquered it. So should everyone get a piece of the pie now? Or should we just say that Palestine belongs to today's Palestinians? Those are the people who live there today, who settle there, and who identify with the land. Okay. Oh, that reminds me of another piece of evidence. They actually found chariots, and the very oldest chariots discovered in Egypt, get this, were made of birch wood. Hey, birch trees grow up there. You don't find birch trees in the Mediterranean. And processed with birch tar. That's also only found up there. Isn't that fascinating? Those trees don't exist in the Mediterranean. Punk. I mean, Herodotus, one of the oldest and most famous historians, reported long ago that the northern sea peoples crossed over at Patras across the Gulf of Corinth and faced the Peloponnesian army under King Echemos. Echemos van Tegen. And Hilos was the leader of the northern sea peoples. Hilos made Echemos a brilliant proposal, one we know from many movies, great idea, to spare all the soldiers and have just the two best warriors from each side face off in single combat. I think that's good, because at least no one else gets hurt. If Hilos himself wins, the land will be taken. But if Echemos' man wins, then the Heraclids, oh, were they called the Heraclids? Interesting. Return of the Heraclids, right? They weren't Greeks, because that's what the Northerners were called by them. Then they would withdraw for 100 years. That was the deal. Yeah, Hilos lost. Okay. But he didn't die, I should mention. He left the country and agreed not to return for 100 years. Well, in fact, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren themselves, of Hilos came back to the Peloponnese exactly 100 years later and conquered it, dividing it among three brothers. Temenos, as the eldest, received Argos, Cresphontes got Messenia, and Aristodemus received Laconia, including the capital, Sparta. Who were the Spartans? Yes? I'm telling you, history is more exciting than any conspiracy theory, my friends. Yes? And then, at the end of the 13th century BC, they stood there. That's right after the time of Moses. That's exactly the time period. The sea peoples from the north, for example, before the Acropolis. And the attacker was named Xanthos. You might think, wow, that's a Greek name. And he challenged the king of the Athenians, Thymoides, also called Timoides, to a duel. Well, you could think that Xanthos doesn't sound particularly Nordic or Western. Yeah, it sounds more Greek, right? Ah, are you thinking of Xanten in Germany? Oh, come on. Right? So, the name Xanthos translates to the blonde one in Old High German. That's the German language. Yeah, he was called the blonde one by the Greeks. Well, Xanthos lost the duel, but he wasn't killed by this time Timoides, the ruler of Athens, but by one of his warriors named Melanthos. He had someone else fight in his place. The king himself was too cowardly to fight. But after Melanthos defeated Xanthos, the people weren't too happy that the king had someone else fight for him and acted cowardly. So they deposed the king and gave the royal title to the fighter himself, Melanthos. A great story. Really. Yeah. The Philistines, as we know, also worked as mercenaries and armies themselves. That was also the case later during the Celtic era, during the Viking era, and they often served other governments as well, yes. Why? Because they were such fierce, strong, and above all, tall warriors. Think of Goliath versus David, warriors from the far north, yeah. When a guy who's 6'5" meets someone who's 5'2", that's obviously pretty impressive. Yeah, that means the armies of the northern peoples were made up only of their own people, but those of the Mediterranean powers had, yeah, Philistine fighters among them. Yeah, guys, those were the Philistines. So, and as I said, they fought alongside. And they went to Palestine. Moses carefully led them there. He was Ramses the Eighth. Ramses is also called Rames. Rameses was also a verbal form of the title. Rameses, if you take away Ra, the god. Then you have Moses. It's actually pretty simple. We just couldn't figure it out for the last thousands of years because we didn't have access to the writings. The papyri weren't available to us. We didn't know about the reliefs in Medinet Habu. Egyptology isn't even that old yet. And all the writings and scrolls that are available to us today give us the opportunity to, well, I have to call them lies, I'm sorry, to reveal, to expose, to lay them bare. And that's what happened there. It all happened there. Right? We also find this occurred to me about 200 years later, a King Saul. Okay, in the Bible, he is named as the first king of the country with an eye in the Middle East. But unfortunately, in all biblical traditions, there are no reliable signs of statehood or royal residence, administrative apparatus, judiciary, military, or economic organization. All of that is missing from non-biblical texts. So who can you believe? It was probably more a tribal chief than a king. Saul is so important because his later son-in-law was the famous King David, the one who is said to have fought against Goliath. Right? I'm telling you, that's not true. That's a different story. And one of his sons was King Solomon, the famous one, who also didn't live there as it's described. The historian Josephus himself, and I have to say, Josephus was an absolute favorite among the Hebrews. He always tried to spin the story so that they came out looking the best. Ideally, humanity would descend from them. But Josephus himself described Saul as a Hellenistic hero. Hell, right? A Hellenistic hero. Islam itself describes Saul as a famous figure of extraordinary stature. Could Saul perhaps have actually been a descendant of the Philistines? Someone like those people back there? The ancient Celts? Only that could explain his extraordinary height. Of course, there are always exceptions, but you can see the clues are really piling up. It's getting really difficult. In conclusion, all I can say is, it's truly impressive what times we're living in and what will be revealed. I also described some of the tribes in the book Moses' Path of Truth, who they really were, where they came from, and where we can find the evidence, and I mean extra-biblical, real, solid evidence. Yeah, once again, so much of it is just made up and full of lies. I keep seeing pictures of Herod, and I made a post about that in my Jesus series. Check it out, about Herod the Great. Herod is a title, not a name. Herod means hero in German. Herod is said to have pursued Jesus in order to kill him. We find the same story in Egypt about Horus, namely, Herod pursued the child Horus. Herod also means hero. In German, we also still say heroes. It's an ancient Indo-European term, an ancient Norse term. And then, they dig up something or other in the Middle East and say, yeah, this is the Herodium now. And let me tell you something, check it out for yourselves. Go online. Take a look. There isn't a single piece of evidence that the Herodium was built or inhabited by Herod, or that he ever even lived there. There's nothing. Not one inscription, not one plaque, not a single personal item that can be linked to Herod. Nothing. They just dug up some site and said, yeah, this is Herod's. Right? That's how history is written. Completely unscientific, unarchaeological, right? It's just to cement an ideology that lacks any evidence. That's how the game is played. But in Europe, and Ireland, and Scotland, even in the flags, and the coats of arms, and everything, we find absolute proof, for example, of the tribe of Judah, right? from King Solomon, from Dahab, from Perez, from Zerah Judah, and so on. It's incredible how we find this evidence, and that's revealed, among other things, in this book, but it goes even further, especially in the book I wrote about Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, the son of Abraham, the foremother and forefathers of the 12 tribes. Yes, but maybe not the ones we think they were. It's not about, and I want to say this again, putting one people above another. It's not about me making any kind of judgment. It's only about one thing, truth. It's only about truth. How can we build a future together? How can we create a future together if we're heading into a bright future that's based on falsehoods? It's not possible. Everything needs clarification now. Above is below, left is right, inside is outside. Everything needs clarification. Of course, you'll find a lot more information in the audiobook or the book. For example, who the Assyrians really were, who the Hittites really were, why many of them were actually blonde, why the same language was spoken in Assyria as in Treverum, that is, in Trier in Germany, and so on and so forth. We'll tell you all about this, including, for example, that the German city of Trier was founded 1300 years before the Romans. You can even still find evidence of this today in Trier itself, at the City Hall, in the exhibition at the Red House, as it's called, on the marketplace. And, there's so much that needs to be clarified, and it gives us a new field of awareness that we can enter, so we can truly allow our future to be filled with light. And that brings me back again to Hans Lakowski from the Tar Astro channel. Once again, thank you so much. Today, that really gave me another boost to make a video. I'll share a few excerpts with you about how he sees things from his perspective, and I want to sincerely thank him for his insights. Check it all out, and here's a little gift from me to Hans Lakowski. Let's talk about the name Hans, because I have it in my name too, Hans Peter, Hans J. Lakowski. And, it's wild. Pay attention, because it really fits today's topic. When I go to German websites, look up birth names, meanings, origins, and type in Hans, just like with all other names, it always says that everything supposedly has a Hebrew origin. But that only applies to us Germans. Wait, what? Only for us Germans? Yes. They trace it back to the Hebrew version of the name Johannes. And so on and so forth, right? I even doubt myself that Johannes is actually Hebrew, but look at this. Then I went to American websites in the US and checked what they say about the name Hans. Well, and there it says that it's an ancient Nordic Germanic name that doesn't have its origins in the Middle East. It says that Hans originates from northern Germany and means the noble one. That's why there's the name Hansstad. It comes from Hans, meaning the nobles. And since people like to look down on the nobles and make jokes about them, the term Hans eventually got a bit of a bad reputation among common folk. People wanted to make fun of the nobles from the Hanseatic cities, or the Hanseatic League itself, and so they targeted the name Hans, which all or many nobles bore. That's how Hans in luck was invented. Hans look in the air. What little Hans doesn't learn, big Hans never will. That's where all these sayings, legends, and tales came from. That has to do with Hans, the nobleman. And as I said, on American websites it's described as an ancient Nordic term. So, which is actually correct? Apparently, it's as if Germans aren't supposed to find out that they're German. There's a very deliberate agenda behind this, making sure we get different information than people in other countries. Isn't that incredible? That's another point we could think about, right? The German guilt. Yeah. Like I said, I'm going to play you a few, about 5 or 6 minutes, of video clips from the original by Hans Lakowski from Tar Astro, who, well, can probably confirm most of what I've explained or what I've said so far. And he tells it in his own way. Watch the whole video, because he also shares some very interesting things from his personal perspective that are really worth seeing, hearing, taking in, and processing. With that, I wish you all the very best, God's blessings, and may you be enlightened. We'll see each other. I'm really looking forward to it. See you soon.
He gave a talk about the Pop, about the Pope, about Trump, and about Israel. And of course, a rabbi talking about Israel is completely normal. But then the content was such that, how should I put it, at least for people who have no idea, and I know many Jewish Dutch fellow citizens who are really on this Israel, rabbi, rabbinical trip, and for them, what a rabbi says is really like, for others, how should I say, like for people who aren't very critical in a Christian environment or in an Islamic environment. For everyone who belongs to a monotheistic religion, it's just like what the pastor or the head of an Islamic community says. Namely, that's law. And there's no discussion about it. People just roll their eyes to the heavens, hoping it will pass or that somehow they're doing everything right. And then, basically, 1, 2, 3, you're right back in the box of religious dependency. And then what had to happen, happened. It didn't take long. The next morning, which was today, yesterday, and today, I listened to a wonderful video by Hans-Peter Fryer from Liechtenstein about Moses. And then for me, it was like all the bells of memory started ringing at once. Hans-Peter Fryer from Liechtenstein talked about this in his introduction to his video, and afterwards he treated us to 2 chapters from his book about Moses. Or rather, I should say, about Ramses VIII. And of course, I won't give anything away if anyone listens to the excellent video by Mr. von Liechtenstein. They'll find out who Moses really was, and I have something to say about that as well. Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our teacher. Moshe Rabbeinu. And so Moses, our teacher. That's what the Jews and the devout Jews call him. So, and you have to be careful here, read between the lines, and also speak between the lines, you know, so as not to step on anyone's toes. People didn't really have that knowledge anyway. What's the point of talking to people with sharp and polished tongues, who are ideologues and nothing else mentally? They're always ideologues, devoted to their religion. And of course, all they've ever done is work on what they also preach to the outside world. They're absolute experts and they're good speakers. So what's the point of talking to these people? They're always right. When I heard what came out in that historic video from Mr. von Liechtenstein, I can only confirm it from my perspective. Because if his statements are true, and I have no doubt about that, since they also match those of Mr. von Liechtenstein, they also align with what, for example, other channels are sharing. The Fifth Kind, for example, Paul Wallace. Yes, that major channel run by a former Anglican priest and Bible scholar who could actually read and translate the scriptures in their original form, not just interpret, but truly translate them. He, along with Eric von Daniken and many others, are people who really know a lot about this ancient history. Well, everything else I could only confirm from my own experience. And Mr. von Liechtenstein also said that, actually, no one, no people, should presume to be privileged. But what do you do when, from the cradle to the grave, you're always told you belong to the chosen people, and yet you're not treated as chosen at all? Yeah, so what do they do then? Then they only start treating themselves as chosen once they are actually chosen. The bloodline is what matters, right? And that goes back thousands of years to those stories in the Bible. But what if they're wrong? Yeah, and I just want to lay the cards on the table now. What if Moses isn't actually Moshe Rabbeinu? Moses, our teacher, and we're supposed to be the Israelites? What if the Israelites were actually completely different people? Yeah, just like Peter Fryer von Liechtenstein says, or rather, discovered. And he's not the first one to have discovered it. He just explained it in a way that's easy to understand. What if that's not true? Yeah. What if these chosen people who are just people like you and me, but have become who they are because of so much suffering and so many lies? And if they had or have criticism of their government there, then of course they're allowed to express it there. And if it gets to be too much, they start a war. And then they all gather again under the umbrella of solidarity. I've seen that happen so many times. Yeah, so criticism is always a good thing and it should be allowed. But whenever things get dicey, the governments, and especially the rabbis there, who are part of the government, step in. The conservatives, the ultra-conservatives, are the ones in charge there. And every government falls in line under that. Yeah. Why do you think certain prime ministers have been taken out of the picture, sidelined? Yeah, that's something to think about. And also, well, right up to the final consequence. Yeah, so then they start a war and suddenly everyone is in solidarity, because then you keep your mouth shut, then you're supposed to keep quiet. And I just want to tell you one more story. First, I want to add, what if that's not true? Yeah, then there will be an incredible sadness, just like Peter said. And a lot of work has already been done in this area. And, yes, we've got the white hats involved, yeah. So the question was, what if that's not true? If Moshe Rabbeinu, that is, Moses, was not our teacher, as in, if the Jewish people, as I said, if he wasn't our teacher, but actually someone completely different? What if Moses was actually Ramses VIII, and therefore had nothing at all to do with the four-letter name of God, and also never received the tablets on Mount Sinai? What then? Then there will be grief. But by the way, life goes on. And that's what Moshe, well, not Moshe, but what Shapira overlooked, the rabbi who just yesterday frightened and terrified people with that video. Yeah, he doesn't see this bridge. Yeah, because these people, this nation, is still being led by the nose, you know. And it won't be long before all of this comes out. And who's behind it all? That's what the time of revelation is about. It's the bright energies of light. And